let me give you a very warm welcome to this evening's webinar. It's good that you're joining us and that people are still coming into the room. Just the usual reminders in a webinar. There is a chat room, there is a question and answer. Question and answer place at the bottom there. So if you wish to ask a question, raise a question, then please do so. And when we come to the question and answer, you'll be able to do that. And I'll do my best to ensure that people's questions are conveyed to our two presenters, and give a very warm welcome to both of our presenters this evening. Sarah Vaughan was with us at our previous webinar. Sarah has some internet connection issues, so we may just hear her rather than see her for parts of this. I know that she will be able to overcome those difficulties, no doubt, and we too can be a little bit patient if there are any difficulties. And Alex de Waal, who's joining us from the United States. So both welcome to you both. As you know, Lord David Alton was also to join us, but he's not able to do that. He's participating in debate in the House of Lords on a recent report, the UK and China's security and trade relationships, which he is a member of the committee that produced the report, so he's required to speak. We know that that's a subject very close to David's heart, so we hope the debate goes well. However, I do know that we are in the hands of leading experts on our subject matter this evening, and we'll be well served by their insights. My name is Vaughan Jones, and I'm the minister at Union Chapel in Islington. And this webinar this evening, which we've organised, is a follow-up from a previous one, which we did. And it was a webinar which we organised on the situation in Tigray, and the very real concern at that time that the genocide was underway. And one of the very important points that was made in that webinar was the invisibility of the situation in Tigray vis-a-vis the war in Ukraine. And David Alton pointed out that the media just cannot look in two places at once, which is a real limitation on our knowledge of what is happening in the world. And tonight we're going to look at the interconnectedness then of the current situation in the Horn of Africa and the impact of the Russian tactics in the war in Ukraine on a wider horizon. And I do hope that you've received a copy of the Tigray timeline, Famine as a Weapon of War, which was produced to us very kindly by Peter Dansite of the Brussels-based International Peace Information Service. It may be that some people who registered quite late haven't received it, but I'll check at the end if there is anybody who won't have yet received it, and make sure you do get it. I know that many people listening will be very concerned for family and friends facing bombardments in Tigray at this time, and are denied humanitarian assistance. And we here are hosting this webinar out of our concern for the diaspora community and our relationship with the diaspora community here in London. And they're important to us here at Union Chapel Church, and for all, indeed, all who are deprived of the food they need. But let me begin by inviting Alex de Waal to speak to us from his vast knowledge and experience on this subject of famine as it is used as an instrument of war. Alex.
Thank you, Vaughan, and I'm glad that you're able to join us, particularly on a day when there are many other distractions, especially in the UK. And of course, in the UK, it's humorous that a lettuce can outlast a political regime. But that actually captures something of the logic of hunger as a weapon. The idea is that by depleting the food supply of a country, it will bring that country to its knees. So it is a race between the longevity of a regime and the resilience of its food supply. And if you can destroy the latter, the logic is that you can undermine the former. And hunger is actually, has been shown in history to be a terribly effective weapon. It is a way of bringing a country to its knees, and has done so over history. It was hunger, for example, more than anything else that defeated the Germans in World War I. And the Germans intended to use it on an even vaster scale to defeat the Soviet Union in World War II. Now, today, there are some 270 million people around the world who are food insecure. And what I want to draw a distinction between that generalized food insecurity and the very sharp phenomenon of famine, which is as different from food insecurity as cold water is different from ice. There's a change in state. And if we look back at the history of the last few centuries, what we've seen is a gradual process whereby the old agrarian famines that used to, in this terrible decade by decade drumbeat, used to cause millions or tens of millions of fatalities in famines around the world, that has faded as the world has become more prosperous, as we have become less reliant on that annual harvest. The causes of acute food insecurity and famine have changed. And over the last 30, 40 years, it is almost exclusively the case that when famines occur, famines being episodes that kill through starvation tens of thousands of people, almost exclusively these are associated with political action, and in particular armed conflict, and in most specifically the use of starvation as a weapon in order to degrade and undermine the other party in the conflict, from the starvation sieges that we've seen in Syria, the mass deprivation of food and plundering in northeast Nigeria, the huge depredations caused by raiding and forced displacement in South Sudan, the countrywide blockade and interruption of essential services combined with aerial bombardment and disruption in Yemen, and of course in Tigray, and where we have what is undoubtedly the most protracted and severe starvation crime of living memory. The verb to starve is transitive. Starvation isn't something that just happens, it's something that people do to one another. So starvation is one of the oldest weapons of war. One of the earlier documented instances was the Roman siege of Carthage, usually, or in fact always accompanied by other gross violations. It doesn't stand on its own. What is, I think, singles out the use of starvation in modern times is that in the late 19th century, in the first half of the century, with the great international global effort to regulate the instruments of war, starvation was not included in those attempts to regulate war. So that the tactics of naval blockade, which had been used to terrifying effect by the great naval powers in the late 19th century, there was a move to outlaw them at the turn of the 20th century. And the British, then the great naval power of the day, didn't want to do that. They blocked the prohibition quite deliberately, anticipating there might be a war in which they would be using that blockade, which indeed happened, World War I. In World War II, both the British and the Americans, along with the Axis powers, also used starvation. In fact, the campaign in 1945 by the Americans to bring Japan to its knees included three elements. There was the plan for a ground invasion, there was the atomic bomb, and there was what they candidly called Operation Starvation. I need say no more. And at the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, starvation as a crime was excluded. No one was prosecuted. The one case in which a starvation crime was raised, a starvation war crime was raised in conjunction with the siege of Leningrad, the German general was acquitted of that charge on the grounds that it was not outlawed under the laws of war as they existed at the time. And it was therefore not included in the Geneva Conventions of 1949. It was only a generation later, in 1977, in the aftermath of Biafra and Bangladesh, and the revulsion of the newly independent nations of the global south, that the use of starvation in colonial pacification strategies. The British had their own Operation Starvation, so named, in Malaya. It was only in 1977 that the Geneva Conventions actually, for the first time, included a clause prohibiting starvation, or rather identifying it as something that was contrary to international humanitarian law, not criminalizing it. I'll get to that point in a moment. But the definition that was introduced in the 1977 additional protocols was around the destruction, removal, or rendering useless of objects indispensable to the survival of the civilian population, including impeding relief as provided for under the Geneva Convention. Important thing to notice here is that starvation in its legal sense, therefore, is not just food, it is anything indispensable for the survival of the civilian population. So that would be water, shelter, medicine, maternal care for children, and one could expand upon that list. In 2002, with the adoption of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, this became a crime under international criminal law for the first time, the same formulation. Interestingly, at that time, it was included only for international armed conflicts, not for non-international armed conflicts or civil wars. And the reason for that was that no one was paying attention. No one in the drafting committees paid much attention to starvation. It wasn't an issue. There was an attempt by the Cubans to prohibit blockade, blocked by the Americans. Remember, the Americans had been blockading Iraq, and the blockade of Iraq had, it was believed at that time, caused many hundreds of thousands of children to die, which the Americans considered, to quote Madeleine Albright, a price worth paying. So there was that, it was, and it was only 3 years ago that actually the statute of the International Criminal Court, the Rome Statute, was amended to prohibit starvation as a war crime in non-international armed conflict. So the progress has been very, very belated and quite slow. And in 4 years ago, 2018, the UN Security Council adopted Resolution 2417 on armed conflict and hunger. And that was a resolution, a unanimous resolution pushed by the Netherlands, especially, that brought together a number of different concerns over the obstruction of relief, over the absence of a system for notifying the international community, especially the UN system, when armed conflict was causing food insecurity and hunger. It didn't introduce new law, but it did make reference to the fact that starvation as a weapon could be a war crime. And this, in retrospect, was a high point in this international campaign to expose and outlaw and prohibit, prevent and punish starvation crimes. Since then, we've seen something of a rollback. Meanwhile, even though human rights experts, notably in South Sudan, most recently on Ethiopia, with a focus on Tigray, have made mention of this, and actually in the case of South Sudan have gone quite far in specifying what would constitute the crime of starvation in the context of South Sudan. The consensus around this is, let me be generous, it is slipping. And two manifestations of this. The first being that when the African Union, belatedly 4 years later, got to debate the issue of armed conflict and hunger. That was in May of this year, so 4 years after Resolution 2417. No mention was made in the AU communique of starvation being a crime. It was all about the importance of improving food supply, some stuff on food access, promoting humanitarian relief, nothing on the criminality of starvation. And then last month, the Irish, who have been championing this issue at the UN Security Council, finally got a thematic debate on Security Council Resolution 2417. And it was pretty disappointing. One of the notable things in the report of the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs to the Security Council was when it made reference to a particular line in 2417. It's a line that requires the UN Secretary General to swiftly report to Council when armed conflict threatens to cause widespread food insecurity. In that report, they removed the word swiftly. And I think given that it had taken some 20 months from the first alarms of conflict causing food insecurity in Tigray for the UN to actually begin to discuss it, that was to cover their own embarrassment. And what we see in the report and in the debate is that they talk about the need for international humanitarian law to be respected, to encourage the parties to respect the requirement of feeding the hungry. There is no mention of the criminality of depriving people of food, of inflicting starvation on the populations. There is a tendency in the international community to obscure criminality under a blanket of logistics, to say the problem is we don't have the money, or we don't have the supply or the fuel, or their operational problems in feeding the hungry, obscuring the reality that actually the reason why these people are hungry is that the crime of starvation is being perpetrated, usually as part of a campaign of extermination, genocide, or the most brutal form of military repression. Tigray being the most terrible exemplar in the world today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alex. That's really very helpful introduction to us. Perhaps we could move over to Sarah for her introduction. Sarah, as we know, is someone who is both very knowledgeable and very passionate about the situation of people in the Horn of Africa and Ethiopia in particular. And she's going to begin by talking about the background to the current situation and historical parallels. Sarah, we hope this works.
Vaughan, I hope that you can hear me. I'm having great difficulties with my connection this evening, for which I apologise. I'm going to continue speaking without my video in the hope that that will allow you to hear what I have to say. It's a great pleasure to join you tonight.
We can hear you.
Great. Apologies for the technical issues. So the last time we discussed the situation in Tigray, Vaughan, in the April seminar that you organised, I talked about 6 categories of human rights violations which were being perpetrated against the people of Tigray by the Ethiopian government and its Eritrean and Amhara allies. It's worth briefly recapitulating them. They are the extrajudicial execution of non-combatants, the systematic patterns of rape and sexual violence, ethnic cleansing and the internal displacement of civilians, indiscriminate aerial bombardment by shelling, by drone and by plane, extrajudicial detention, extortion and killings of Tigray origin citizens beyond the war zones. And finally, what we're going to talk about this evening, the deliberate starvation of civilians in Tigray and the destruction of their means of livelihood. All of these categories of abuses continue, and in fact, the first four have massively exacerbated over the 57 days since fighting resumed on the 24th of August. We're in good company tonight. It's Alex and his colleagues at Tufts University, which issued a report in April 2021, documenting the deliberate demolition of the food system, of the economy, and of the means of livelihood in Tigray by Ethiopian and Eritrean military forces. That's April 2021. Think how many months have passed since then. That report documents how Ethiopian and Eritrean forces achieved this by means of wholesale looting and the deliberate destruction of items essential to the survival and livelihoods of Tigrayans during the period from November 2020 to June 2021. And the effects of this campaign were exacerbated when the two governments then went on to block assistance to the region. The targeted looting and destruction went far beyond any military rationale and speaks to a determination to exterminate, with echoes of the Ethiopian wars of the 1980s. Specialist analysts have suggested that the worst period of starvation deaths in Tigray throughout the last 2-year period was in and immediately after this 6-month period of administration of Tigray by Addis Ababa's so-called transitional government. But honestly speaking, we still don't know, because we still in April, in July 2021, already more than a year ago now, after only a couple of weeks of the siege. By August, only 7% of food needs were being allowed into Tigray, and the situation continued through the end of the year with escalating malnutrition. The government doubled down and expelled a series of senior UN officials around a year ago now for allegedly meddling in a move that even the UN Secretary General described as illegal. The government stopped UN flights to Mekelle. Even The Economist magazine accused it of starving its own people. By January, Tigray's Health Bureau had reported 5,500 deaths from disease and malnutrition between June and October, attributable to the blockade. The UN said it would run out of stocks at the end of January, under what it too described as a de facto blockade. At the end of February, it said it would cease all operations, and a couple of airlifts in early February provided a fraction of needed medical supplies, the first deliveries since September of the previous year. Between April and August this year, as the Ethiopian government seemed to be feeling the heat and wanted the international community to open the purse strings, things changed a bit. Convoys of food did move into Tigray through the Abala route from Afar to Mekelle in eastern Tigray. And in due course, the World Bank turned the tap back on to bail out the Ethiopian economy in a move which, to put it politely, raised eyebrows. But no food moved in through any of the other routes into Tigray, which continued to be blockaded. Until the fighting resumed in August, the food supplied was around 15% of what the UN said was needed. And farcical constraints were placed on what humanitarian agencies were allowed to bring in. Banking, telecoms, and power stayed off. Since fighting started again on the 24th of August, nothing has moved. In mid-2020, it was known that the numbers of those dying slow and excruciating deaths from starvation were again mounting in Tigray. Initially infants and the elderly, and those whose health was complicated by medical conditions that could not be treated after Tigray's health systems had been looted, destroyed, and systematically deprived of drugs. The continuing block on media and reporting meant that it was impossible to know how many may have died or may have continued to face, may still continue to face, an awful and agonizing death. Since the fighting began again in August, there have again been indications of military strategies from Eritrean and Ethiopian federal forces, which have little to do with the capture of military targets, but which seem more to be focused on moving civilians into situations of extreme precarity, deliberately kettling them into areas without food by means of scorched earth bombings of their villages. The Ethiopian government's own statements of the last few days have announced without shame that food will be made available in the areas they control. This is, as Alex has just explained, a declaration of criminal intent vis-à-vis those in other areas. I want, before I finish, to dwell briefly on the historical parallels with Ethiopia's famine in the 1980s. There is something of a consensus that up to or around 500,000 people died in the famine of the mid-1980s. The vast majority of them in Tigray and in neighboring areas of North Waal and Waal. Much of the contemporary coverage suggested natural causes, drought, as key. But a closer analysis suggests that this was not the primary driver of starvation deaths. Rather, as now, multiple evidence indicates that the deliberate military and political strategies of the Ethiopian government and its allies caused many of these deaths. In some, and I quote from a recent book to which Alex and his colleagues have contributed, it would not be correct to attribute the 1984-85 famine to an overall food shortage. There was a severe drought, but famine was not inevitable, and the pattern of who starved when and where was the result of political decisions. One set of political causes of famine was misguided economic policies. Another and more substantial set of causes was military. The famine as a whole can be considered a crime, end of quote. It is a crime, incidentally, that wasn't prosecuted in the 1990s. And that is a mistake which, in my view, should not be made a second time. There are other parallels. The Ethiopian government's aerial bombardment of market centres was a feature of the war in the 1980s, when at least 43 civilians were killed at a market in Togoga in Tigray on the 22nd of June 2021. The UN expressed its concern, and Reuters reported that medical assistance to the wounded was blocked by military personnel closing the road to Mekelle, 30 miles away. Less remarked upon was the fact that this strike took place on the well-known anniversary of a notorious bombardment of the market of the Tigrayan town of Hausian by the Derg on the 22nd of June 1988, in which several thousand market goers are thought to have died. Some of you may remember the slogan that was used by the Ethiopian government in the 1980s, that to catch the fish, you have to drain the sea. You may remember it because you've heard it again recently in new rhetoric about Tigray and the TPLF, a new generation of hate speech. People saying, we can't supply aid to Tigray because it would be giving succor to our enemies. But waging war in such a way that civilians are deprived of access to the food and medicines they need to live is a crime of war. It is against international humanitarian law. This is what was done in the 1980s, and it is what is being done again today. The second set of parallels relates to failures of the international community to act in a timely way to try to redress a famine, which then, as now, was out of sight and out of mind. International bureaucrats in Ethiopia have for many decades been quick to declare that famine has been averted, even when the factors driving it remained in place. When on the 15th of July this year, the UN World Food Programme's head of operations for northern Ethiopia repeated precisely this claim about Tigray, albeit with many caveats, many heard the echo of earlier failures. As seasoned observers, Angela Raven-Roberts and Sue Lautze have noted dryly, famines in Ethiopia are not declared, nor are they averted, but rather they are declared to be averted. In sum, 2 weeks from today, it will be exactly 2 years since the military phase of this catastrophe began. We have known what was going on now for 2 years. It is no longer good enough for the international community to try to be even-handed in their approach or suggest some false equivalence between the parties. Whatever else may be going on, only one side in this conflict is starving its citizens deliberately. Nor is it enough to say that we didn't know. In the first 5 days of the war, I and a group of other academics, signed an appeal which concluded, this is already in November 2020, particularly Tigray is heading for famine, for a repetition of the disaster of 1984-85. We call upon the world to urge for negotiations and ceasefire in northern Ethiopia and rapidly to organize efficient delivery of food and other humanitarian aid to Tigray. 2 years later, we are still calling on a world that has failed and is failing the people of Tigray. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I think we did hear that. I think probably 98% of what you were saying. So thank you very much. We can move into questions now, and questions are coming in. I don't know, Alex, whether you want to just tell us the title of the book that you were waving.
So this book is called Accountability for Mass Starvation: Testing the Limits of the Law, and it is a, how many chapters is it? I will have to tell you. It's one of those thick academic books published by Oxford University Press, which has 15 different contributions on the history and theory, on case studies, on the law, and then on some on cross-cutting issues, including gender, transitional justice, memory, and reporting of famines. And so this is recently out. And there was the first question, which I gave a very brief answer
Yes.
to, was why had I not made reference in my opening remarks to the hunger, and actually there's an interesting question, whether it counts as famine or not. I'll get onto that. That recurrently actually occurred several times in southeastern Ethiopia during the counterinsurgencies against the Oromo, the Ogaden National Liberation Front. The reason I say the controversy over famine was, it was actually these particular occasions that gave rise to and the controversies about how bad it was, that gave rise to the systematic studies that led to the development of the integrated food security phase classification system by a number of international experts, many of them associated with the UN, which is now the standard. The other point I would make in that regard is that after the EPRDF took power in 1991, it made the conquest of famine and the relief of extreme poverty absolutely the centerpiece of its development strategy. Also the national security strategy as well, which wasn't to say that it wasn't always, it was always achieved. And there's some egregious cases in which in not only in the Ogaden, also in Gambela, where for various reasons there were some fairly appalling abuses. But one of the key achievements of that period was that when Ethiopia was stricken by drought and nationwide food supply failure in 2015, the government, with the current Minister of Finance, Ahmed Shide, actually, as one of the key people, along with the current Deputy Prime Minister Demeke Mekonnen, they were able to activate their own mechanisms, their own financial mechanisms, their own administrative mechanisms, to put in place a remarkably rapid and efficacious response that prevented that drought descending into famine. It was held, it didn't get any publicity. If you avert a famine, journalists don't cover it. But it is held up by those who study the issue as an exemplar of, as it were, the next generation of famine prevention. Now, tragically, what we see currently is with those two same individuals in government, with the knowledge of the institutional, financial, and other capabilities that are needed to prevent food insecurity in Ethiopia as a whole. Leaving aside Tigray, when faced with a comparable climatic shock, which is actually no greater in terms of food supply shortfall than it was 7 years ago, they are on their knees begging the international community instead of responding in an independent, effective way as they were able to 7 years ago, which is another tragedy of what has happened in Ethiopia. So, not unrelated to the war in Tigray, both of them symptoms of a cataclysmic failure of political leadership.
Thank you. Moving into the questions then, a question here. It's been largely debated by Alex Duval and others, for example, Australian International Council, that by the time famine is declared, it's already too late to save lives, even if the humanitarian aid is escalated. And in times where starvation is being used as a weapon of war, this declaration using the IPC criteria becomes near to impossible, where you have a government determined to avoid the label of famine. So the questions then are there any of the IPC partners, which are mostly aid agencies, with objective of saving lives, aware of this circumstance? And is there any work being done to overcome this obstacle? And can you suggest some organizations for the Tigray advocates can approach from the IPC partners and perhaps, or human rights organizations? Or perhaps you could just, for the benefit of people listening, you can explain the IPC.
So the IPC is the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System developed in Ethiopia and Somalia some 10, 15 years ago, and which is now the general standard for assessing the level of food security or insecurity that in a particular place, ranging from normal through stressed, crisis, emergency, and then the last stage 5 being famine. And when a place is assessed as being in stage 5 famine, it is on the basis of 3 basic indicators. One is the number of people, that is basically children who are dying. The second is level of nutrition, and the third is level of food supply and access to food in that particular location. And and in order to assess or declare famine, you need to, according to the technical criteria, you need to have all those 3 evidence for each of those three elements: food availability, food system in the locality, nutrition, and mortality. Now, the problem that arises is because the label famine carries with it such a stigma that a government does not want to admit that famine is there. And this is not only the case for Ethiopia, it's also the case in Yemen, in Nigeria, in South Sudan, etc. And there's actually a very simple way of stopping famine being declared, which is to stop the evidence being gathered, or stop some of the evidence being gathered. Enough evidence to mean that the only conclusion that can be reached is we don't really know. Now, in June of last year, that is some 15, 16 months ago, the famine review committee convened by the IPC did their review of Tigray. And they said Tigray is on the brink of famine, and there are 4 different scenarios. And depending on the development in the war and the humanitarian aid that is provided, this was a time when no harvest would be expected over the coming 3 months. And according to 2 of the 4 scenarios, famine would occur inevitably by September of last year, that is 13 months ago. The worst scenario played out as it happened. And yet the UN did not follow up the logic of saying, okay, we know, the best experts have told us there must be famine. They just continued to pussyfoot around the issue. And subsequently, the only time that any survey team has been allowed in was in late November, early December, at a time when the rather meager harvest had been gathered and food security had improved. And by dint of denying the data gathering, the Ethiopian government has been able to dodge the very obvious conclusion that anyone, you don't need to be a food security expert, you just need to be able to add 1 and 1 to make 2. The very obvious conclusion that famine has been occurring, not all the time, not everywhere, but in certain locations with that relentless inevitability at certain times. So how do we get around this problem? I mean, the basic thing is for the UN agencies to be courageous and say what's happening. Well, that is not happening. I mean, if when the Tigray government repossessed fuel supplies from World Food Programme back in August, within a day, the World Food Programme was declaring this as a crime. 2 days ago, when the Eritreans looted the food, all the food supplies, the UN food supplied in Shire, we don't hear a word from World Food Programme. There is clearly a double standard here at work, and we don't, all of us who've worked in Ethiopia know what that double standard is. The evidence that has been gathered independently by Jan Nyssen and his colleagues at the University of Ghent, they just published their most recent update of their figures, I think 2 days ago. They say somewhere between 385,000 and 600,000 civilians died in Tigray since the start of the war. That is utterly appalling, and that is very rigorously assessed evidence. So the technicalities can be overcome. The problem is that high-level political blockage, particularly within the UN system. It has to be, I remember when, 35 years ago, I remember being in Tigray with Sarah, and we were shocked at the attitude of the UN at that time. We thought it couldn't get any worse. Well, I'm afraid we were wrong. It has got worse.
Thank you. There's a question here, which is, what is your advice to the TPLF who started this war in 4th November 2020 and 24th August 2022, prefer to play victim politics and stop the disaster? Sarah, is there anything you'd like to add to the previous question, and whether you'd like to?
Let me just say that yes, I mean, the Tigrayans started the war in the same sense that the Poles started World War II. If you have an enormous army about to invade you, and you start the fighting, yes, you have some culpability for the timing and manner of the starting of the conflict, but particularly this last round. I mean, after Abiy had moved his army into Eritrea and placed it under the control of Isaias, who ever thought that Isaias, having control of the greater part of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, was doing it for sort of training exercises or something? I mean, come on, we live in the real world and we understand who Isaias is.
Well, maybe I'll just add this question, Sarah, and then you can come in. The international donors have been donating millions of dollars to Tigray since the genocidal war started. However, 7% of humanitarian aid is allowed to enter Tigray. Why are the donors not requesting where the donations are gone or used for, but rather they continue to donate more dollars than the Abiy Ahmed is using to buy weapons and drones? Plus, Isaias has been looting to Eritrea, even now since Eritrea occupied Shire. They're looting the aids and food to Eritrea. There's quite a few things there, Sarah. Do you want to comment on any of them?
Yes, of course. And I hope that you can hear me. I'm not getting absolutely everything. So, I mean, perhaps on Gannett's question, this last point, I think there's a bit of confusion. I'm not suggesting that only 7% of what was available was allowed to enter Tigray, but only 7% of what was needed, according to the UN at last year, and 15% more recently, was able to enter Tigray. So I think, I mean, whether or not aid is being diverted to other purposes elsewhere in Ethiopia, there are obviously very, very serious other needs in the rest of the country, not least because, as Alex has said, the institutional architecture for dealing with famine has been, I would say, deliberately or certainly negligently dismantled or allowed to atrophy since 2018. I mean, you remember the National Disaster Risk Management Commission, NDRMC, which was really a jewel of the Ethiopian government. And it had its problems, but it really was remarkably effective and was something which was placed within the hierarchy, directly reporting to the Prime Minister's office. Within months of this Prime Minister coming to power, he'd downgraded it and placed it as a mere department under the Ministry of Peace, which I think was a kind of clear indication of, well, let me be charitable and say, a lack of understanding of quite how important this issue of food security is to the Ethiopian national. Brought up in a verdant part of the country. Ethiopia, as we know, is very diverse. If you live your life in Addis Ababa and never experience what the situation is like in many parts of the country, but certainly those areas of the north which are food insecure, you may simply not be aware or not understand quite how I spent 25 years telling diplomats that Ethiopia is a bit like the Netherlands. If you don't have a state which pumps the water out, an awful lot of the country is going to be underwater. Ethiopia is the same. It never should have the sort of Anglo-American night watchman slender state, the sort of neoliberal state that does very little, because it has this structural problem of 30 million people in any year not being able to produce enough to feed themselves, and a lot more in some ways. So you need an architecture which is able to satisfy those problems. And it's the state that needs to step in and provide that framework, not just in terms of the sort of logistical organization of the food delivery, but also in terms of this sort of huge elasticity which is needed in the transport infrastructure. You know, the transport, no market for transport is able to expand to the extent that it can cope with what's needed when there are real times of need. So you have to have a really good infrastructure in place in order to be able to respond, and in order to be able to get food not just to central hubs, but out to every village where it's needed. We've seen, for instance, that yes, all very well that some convoys of aid were allowed to reach Mekelle over the period between April and August, but if the government didn't allow adequate supplies of fuel to go in with that food, how on earth was it supposed to be distributed beyond the city to those other parts of the region that needed it? So I think, you know, it very, very much goes back to this question of political focus, political interest, political understanding of the leadership in Ethiopia at the moment, and their willingness to think seriously about what are the real needs of the majority of their population, then rather than this obsession with propaganda and window dressing and narratives, which many people now recognize to be fake, very attractive, very much designed to appeal to the urban population, but really with no substance underneath it. So the basic functions of any state, which are to maintain the monopoly of violence, to gather taxation, to fulfill the basic needs of populations, to food and water and shelter, have simply been abrogated since 2018. You know, Ethiopia already within a few months of the change of government became the biggest focus of IDPs anywhere on the planet. So, you know, all of the achievements of 25, 30 years, which had been won and hard fought and hard built over the period from 1991 have been frittered away. And I feel great sorrow, not only for the excruciating situation of the people of Tigray, but for the rest of the population of Ethiopia, whose children are going to pay the price of this wanton destruction of what's being built. I hear the question coming in relation to the TPLF and them playing victim politics. That's not really how I see the situation. I think the TPLF has been in an impossibly difficult situation. I think, you know, it's very easy in hindsight to say they should have been more conciliatory, they should have pushed harder to try to avoid war. My own view is that there was nothing that they could have done to avoid the kind of net which was tightening around them already in 2019 and 2020. But that's a wider political discussion for another forum. I think whatever one's view of the politics, these are crimes which are being committed against Ethiopia's citizens, and they need to be held to account. Thanks very much.
Thank you. There's a little collection of questions which I think are really very important. You know, who are the British politicians taking action on this? Well, we know David Alton is. Are there any? As you know, the people of Tigray are on complete siege for the last 2 years. What do you think the problem is that the worldwide community, the Western world particularly, is not giving attention and looking for solutions to this crisis? Do you think the whole world, except very few of you, chooses to be silent by just simply saying we are concerned, but not actually responding? What are your thoughts about that? And I think, you know, it hangs over a little bit from our previous webinar, where there was a feeling that attention was going to Ukraine, but and not to Tigray, and in fact, maybe, you know, in fact, Putin is using some of the similar tactics, you know, there. But what do you think is the response of the Western world? And is there any way of stimulating a better response? I don't know, Alex, do you want to?
May I just make 2 points before getting on to the Western world on this? One is that Africa has to respond. I mean, there is a principle which I think many of us are very sympathetic to, which is that Africa should be in the lead in responding to these kinds of crises. And the old OAU back in the day was notoriously incapable of doing that. And in the wake of a succession of crises in the 90s, most infamously the genocide in Rwanda, African leaders came together and forged a new set of norms, principles, and institutions at the continental level, and created the African Union, which has, you know, its foundational principles enshrined in its constitutive act include non-indifference to grave circumstances like crimes against humanity, the responsibility for taking care of one's neighbors, a duty to act to prevent, manage, and resolve conflict. And those norms, principles, and institutions are never more relevant than in the case of Ethiopia as of 2 years ago. But the AU completely refused to deal with it. In fact, the AU has been really quite openly and explicitly complicit with the government of Ethiopia taking sides in violation of those norms and principles. Let me reiterate that. And that has put the Europeans and the Americans in an awkward position, because having taken the in principle correct position that let the Africans be in the lead, if the Africans are determined to block anything from happening, it's difficult for the Europeans and Americans to overrule them without being seen as colonial. And this has actually reached an absurd extent in this current conflict, because the pen holder at the UN has been Ireland. Now, if there's one country in the world with the most sterling anti-colonial tradition, it is the Irish. And anyone who studies their diplomatic history will know that the country that stood up against the fascist invasion of Italy, the Italian fascist invasion of Ethiopia in 1935, and even threatened war against Italy in defense of the principles of the League of Nations, was Ireland. And yet you now have the Ethiopian Foreign Ministry accusing the Irish of acting in a colonial manner, which is, I think, just shows that the depths of absurdity to which a once proud foreign ministry has now descended. But the point being that it has actually been very difficult, and for actually an understandable reason for the international community to get around this problem. And it's interesting to ask why so many Africans were willing to go along with this. African leaders, perhaps, but in many countries where there is some open press, there is some democratic process, you would have expected opinion writers and public intellectuals to speak out. What happened is when they did begin to do that, they were deluged with a torrent of abuse on social media, to the extent that they thought, okay, we have enough problems in our own country, be it Ghana or South Africa or Kenya or wherever. We're not going to subject ourselves to this kind of abuse, and they just withdrew. And I think that was unfortunately extremely critical in allowing the African narrative to be dominated by this gross misrepresentation of fact and this gross misrepresentation of African principles. So that's a very sort of long preamble. And then on top of that, I'm afraid there is the simple reality of sort of executive overstretch. I mean, there are some very serious other crises around in the world, a lot of demands on limited humanitarian funds, and frankly, racism. No one kind of escaped noticing the way in which European and American correspondents covering the war in Ukraine started pointing out that we care for these people because they look like us. It was as blatant as that.
Sarah, would you like
so I can come in, Vaughan?
Yeah.
Yes, please. I mean, on the Africa issue, I think is really, Alex is absolutely right, and it's terribly important not to underestimate the excruciating impact of the sort of torrent of abuse that everybody who makes any comment or tries to speak about the situation in Ethiopia is on the receiving end of. It really is very difficult. And even for those of us who've lived and breathed Ethiopian politics for decades, it's difficult to deal with. But for non-specialists who feel surely there are principles that are important at stake here, it can be enough to say, oh, well, this is obviously more complicated than we thought, and people back off. So it is deeply, deeply unpleasant, the abuse and the threats of violence, let me be blunt, threats of all sorts of things. So I think that's very problematic. I think there's an aspect of that also in Ethiopia's diplomatic relations with its African peers. Ethiopia's sort of status as non-colonized and the seat of the OAU and so on. I mean, there is great irony for me in a state employing a narrative of sovereignty and of inviolability and of not wanting to be messed with from the outside, whilst requesting the forces of its neighboring state to come and beat up its own citizens. I mean, the ironies of this narratives of sovereignty which are being deployed to try to reject international interference, that's all very well. But Ethiopia is most European and North American countries' biggest aid recipient. So it is a little more complicated than we like to say. I think I would also like to comment a little bit on the British government's failures, and they are failures in relation to Ethiopia. I know that the Foreign Office has had a fairly rocky time of it in the last few years and months, as the British government has too. But I believe, like some other European governments, British is not ethical and is not acceptable. Addis Ababa is a bubble. It's very easy for diplomats to sit there and listen only to their educated peers and colleagues who may sympathize with or fear the government and to put forward that perspective. But that is only one perspective, and I find myself greatly disappointed by what is a failure to adhere to an ethical position, British Foreign Office. I would like to see a much more robust position being adopted. You know, these are crimes that we are talking about. It is not okay that my taxes are being used basically to subsidize a war against Ethiopia's own citizens, because the line which should have been taken has not been drawn more clearly. So I feel extremely critical. I know that these are very, very difficult decisions, but I don't think it's a proper balance has been struck in this instance. And that's also, you know, a very, very difficult trade-offs which are being taken and considered by the international community, foremost amongst them, of course, or most visibly amongst them, the World Food Programme. I agree with Alex. I don't think they've got the balance right. People are too much in awe of the thuggish and threatening might of the Ethiopian state. I'll stop at that point.
Thank you. There's so many questions, and I'm struggling to know which one thing. I mean, there's some questions around the UN and the role of the UN Security Council, and possibility of any kind of coalition of the willing having any chance in the light of the intensity of the war crimes. Any hopes from the UN Security Council A3 asked for it? Do you think if the African Union asked for action, the UN Security Council would go for action, even if China and Russia use their veto? Just wondering. I don't believe the A3 will not ask for that. And another one here about the probability of the UN Security Council to decide for action tomorrow, since the A3 that asked for it. Do you think if the AU asks for action, the UN Security Council will act? So that's a similar question. Yes, and this responsibility to protect is a global political commitment which was endorsed by all members of the UN. To address its key concerns. Following the ICHRE's recent preliminary report on families eminent in Tigray, all four key concerns of the UN are highlighted. Will the UN take this report into consideration and act? What stopped the UN from taking such an action if Secretary General persuaded? And there seems to be a bit of a focus around the UN there. And you've covered some of that, I think, but is there anything you want to say, Alex?
If I just make a few points in response to a number of those. The first is that I think the Ethiopian government made a couple of, from its point of view, rather calamitous diplomatic errors this month. It managed to offend the European Union, the Kenyans, the South Africans, a whole bunch of countries by lying, by saying it had consulted them when it hadn't, by trying to set up a peace process that actually was entirely on the blueprint on its own blueprint, on its mistaken assumption that it was going to win the war by the date of the peace talks on the weekend of October the 8th, 9th. And that's having quite a significant, although rather slow backlash. And I don't know what the AU Peace and Security Council will have decided today, and it's probably still very sympathetic to the Ethiopian government, but it will be less so. And I think we'll see that a bit more of that backlash tomorrow at the UN Security Council. Again, I don't expect them to go very far. In that regard, I think it's remarkable that the principle of R2P, responsibility to protect, has been entirely absent from this debate. When you have large numbers of civilians grievous risk of appalling violations, that the language of that has not been taken up seriously. It's interesting. Just this week, there are beginnings of discussions about the atrocity prevention strategy in Washington D.C., which is the U.S. sort of version of R2P. There's the most recent iteration of that was adopted by President Biden back in July, and this is obviously the number one place where in the world where it should be applied. And at last they're beginning to look into that, though it's been very, very slow. A couple of other points. One is I would actually take Sarah's point about sovereignty a step further. In fact, the Ethiopian army is now under the command of Isaias. So it's, in terms of protection of sovereignty, the one who has handed over the once proud Ethiopian army to the command and control of another state is the Ethiopian Prime Minister, I think. And that Eritrean element is really resonating now. I think there's the idea that Eritreans are marginal to this, that they are somehow uninvited guests, or that they are guests who the Ethiopians can simply ask to leave. That pretense has fallen away. And the central role of Isaias Afwerki is becoming increasingly clear, and that's going to be, I suspect, a major focus of the discussion tomorrow at the UN Security Council. One wider point about DFID. We've talked almost entirely about Ethiopia and Tigray, but there are, this is a discussion more broadly about starvation crimes and food as a weapon of war. The cuts to DFID's budget and subsuming DFID under the Foreign and Commonwealth Office has been a calamity for Britain's effectiveness and standing in many, many parts of the world, most notably in the whole of the Horn of Africa. And just recently, the Somalis were rather acidly pointing out that during the 2016 food crisis in Somalia, DFID took the lead. It was DFID, with its very creative and generous programming, what they called a no regrets programming. And by that, they didn't wait for the evidence to be there that a place was in crisis before they programmed food. The attitude was, we would much rather be proven to be over generous after the fact, than to be presented with the graves of children whom we could have prevented from starving to death, because we stuck too rigorously to our protocols for assessing how bad things were. And that no regrets programming was DFID's flagship. I mean, and 10 years ago, it was David Cameron who said to the Somalis, we will be your champion. And the collapse of Britain's commitment to Somalia and the collapse of Britain's aid budget is so demoralizing. And I'm sure we all understand this, and I would hope that whoever is in number 10 Downing Street next week begins to appreciate this. One final point about hate speech. I take two reassurances from the hate speech that I receive. One is that those who spew hatred and hostility on an ethnic basis towards other people, if they hate me, well, then I know I'm on the right side. And secondly, to those, and every conversation that I have like this, there are people who say, oh, you are representing only TPLF. Well, actually, look, see if I've said a single positive thing about the TPLF, about government of Tigray, Tigray Defense Forces, Tigrayan people. I've said some things. TPLF I have not defended. But the key point I want to make is that there are people within the Ethiopian government establishment who send me every week messages, people who are serving in government, especially in the foreign ministry, who say, keep it up, you're doing the right thing. And so those of you who are, who might be here, who are, consider yourselves Ethiopian patriots by dint of subscribing to the logic of the current prime minister in Ethiopia, be aware that there are people within the system who actually know what is going on, and they are encouraging me to carry on saying what I'm saying.
Thank you. I'm just, Sarah, did you want to add?
Can I agree with that point, Vaughan? I mean, I do think that this is terribly important. I mean, you know, outsiders listening to this conversation, please don't take what you hear at face value. That the propaganda, the rhetoric is daunting, but it is not what even senior Ethiopian decision policymakers really believe.
Yeah.
This is
and let me just add, and generals too. I mean, there is not a single military.
a crazy strategy which has gone out of the control of Addis Ababa, as Alex said. This is really now. Indeed, absolutely. I also agree. I don't think that just because one is criticizing the actions of a government in deliberately starving its people means that one is thereby defending their opponents. We are not defending the TPLF. We are simply analysing the situation as we see it. I think perhaps Zelalem Tesema in particular has raised a couple of really good questions. This question about, well, you know, the monopoly of violence. Yeah, I complained that the monopoly of violence of the state was eroded under Abiy, and wasn't that a reason why they should have fought the TPLF, because that was to restore the monopoly of violence. Zelalem, I don't really agree, because, you know, simply by declaring the TPLF a terrorist organization, you don't suddenly create a new situation. There was a political crisis. There was a disagreement which should have been resolved politically between these two groups. But the TPLF was the party of government, party of Tigray, which had just been re-elected in September 2020. So no, I don't think that does follow. But more importantly, I mean, I think your second question now, where you say, don't you think this discussion will be academic, given latest developments and the fact that basic services are due to start in Shire and other cities that the ENDF control? That goes to specifically one of the central points I wanted to make. It is not good enough for the Ethiopian rich of its citizens. It wants to allow basic services to be responsibility to deliver services to all of those areas. Now, if it can get delivered to Shire 2 months ago, and it should have done, and the fact that it didn't speaks to something which, as we've been discussing, may amount to a war crime. So I think this is a very, very problematic aspect of some of the formal statements of the Ethiopian government just in the last couple of days, which have talked about delivering food and delivering services to areas underneath its control. It is a crime to wage war in a way which deprives civilians of the basics that they need to live. Let me stop at that point and go back to you.
Thank you.
I hope you can.
We can hear you.
Okay,
We can hear you.
Sorry about the.
No, we can hear you very well, Sarah. I think we're coming to the closing part of the webinar now, and I just would like to ask Alex and Sarah just to respond to two things really. The first is on the more general kind of issue. I think one question here asks, are there other places in the world where this is happening? What is the impact of the war in Ukraine on food supplies? And is there a kind of similar kind of situation here where Putin is using the possibility of halting grain supplies actually as a weapon of war? Just to broaden out the the understanding of the concept. And the closing thing, really, the more perhaps we need to do before we finish is to ask about the next steps and what listeners to this webinar could possibly take away in terms of action. If David Alton were here, he would give us a great list of people to write to and action points. But I wonder if you both could respond, and perhaps as a way of bringing this really excellent webinar to a conclusion.
Let me take the Ukraine issue. First of all, the disruption of Black Sea food exports, primarily, but not all Ukraine, was a very serious shock to the world food supply system, and particularly to countries that were reliant on major contracts for delivery of wheat from the Black Sea, countries like Egypt, for example. And that disruption caused enormous hardship. That said, blaming a singular blame on that export was perhaps overstating it, because the world, there is an excess of cereal production in the world. The world's cereal production is actually remarkably flexible, and American and Southern Hemisphere producers can step in quite quickly. And the food price is, global food prices are driven as much by the speculation of commodity traders and markets manipulated by the major global food companies as they are by actions such as those exports. Not to minimize the significance and the fundamental wrongness of what Putin did. And then one of the reasons actually why Putin was ready, I think, to concede and back down and allow the Black Sea Grain Initiative of Guterres and Erdogan to proceed was, well, a couple of reasons. One of them being that the position was actually unsustainable, and Russia in particular would have lost its niche in the global food market had it not resumed exports through the Black Sea, because others would have stepped in and filled the gap. And also it was making Russia deeply unpopular in countries like Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, that were importing food from the Black Sea. So but I think the fundamental misapprehension was the idea that a disruption to food supply meant famine. It didn't. It meant more poverty, more food stress. But famine, as I said right at the beginning, comes about in the context of one group of people systematically depriving another. And there are starvation crimes being conducted in Ukraine too by the Russians. But the Russian-Ukrainian disruption, I think, it can be very readily misrepresented.
Okay, thank you. And then in terms of future actions and ways forward?
I think there's, I mean, at the global level, there is, some fairly fundamental flaws in the global food system that need to be addressed, and I think they've been highlighted. The major food companies are keen not for them to be highlighted, but I think they become inescapable. I think a much clearer focus on the prohibition, the criminalization of starvation is absolutely essential at a global level.
Sarah, do you want to bring the final point?
Yeah, just briefly. I mean, I think we've seen this week a really important shift. Finally, the A3, the African states on the UN Security Council, seem to have shifted their position, and possibly the AU has also shifted its position and is now calling for this closed session discussion tomorrow. That's very important. If the African states are no longer standing in the way of this kind of discussion, I think that would indicate that finally, late, but finally, they have recognized just what it may be that is at stake, and have recognized the level of horror that may be on their watch if they don't do something about this. Having said that, I don't think there's much to be expected from the UN, you know, unless that somebody is going to drop food into parts of Tigray which can't be reached, which would mean a de facto no-fly zone in Tigray. I would like to see that happen. I don't think it's likely to happen. It's one of the few things that could actually change the situation of the civilians that we've been talking about. But having said that, I think it's very, very important for Ethiopians not to wait for outsiders to sort out their problems for them. I think I want my government, the British government, and those institutions that they work with to be robust in their statements vis-a-vis the Ethiopian government. I'd like them to take an ethical position which says this is wrong. We will not condone it. We will not support it directly or indirectly. You must shift around. But at the end of the day, this is a political crisis. It can be only solved politically. And it is Ethiopians who must call for this to happen, who must make this happen. In a sense, I would appeal to those around the current Prime Minister, you know, the Demakes, the red ones. We know them, we've known them for decades. These are not fools. They know what cost is being paid by Ethiopia. They know what is lost, what is being drained away. So I would appeal to Ethiopia's political classes, to its feminists, to its human rights activists, to its civil society activists. Now is the time for you to step up, show courage, and to try to effect a change of strategy, a change of policy from your government. Ethiopia will never have a moment like this when it needs the courage of its citizens. So I would end on that note. Ethiopia's future is in. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sarah. We did, I think, hear absolutely the vast majority of what you were saying. I would say it would be 97, 98% of what you were saying. So that's been extremely helpful and, as always, very insightful and very passionate presentation of the situation and the issues. And to you too, Alex, thank you so much for your contribution. We know that you are renowned as a person with considerable expertise in this area and an authority on the subject, and it's such a privilege for us to have you both of you here with us this evening. It's a subject which understandably and quite rightly creates a lot of passion and a lot of concern, and I know that many people who are in the audience this evening will be so deeply personally involved in the issues and will feel very strongly. I hope that we've been able to address them and that it is a contribution to a situation which is ongoing, that is very real, very live, and also very difficult. And so I think concluding with just some consideration and thought to the people who are right on the front line of this in Tigray itself, and those people who are experiencing starvation at this moment and this evening. And we close with our thoughts for them. So thank you all very much on behalf of Union Chapel Church here, and we will endeavour to maintain our concern and interest and relationships with the communities here in London. So thank you and good evening. Good night.